given the nature of American politics today, anytime you enter into a compromise on an issue of this magnitude, what you're going to get is the other side. You're going to have to give the other side some bad stuff in order to get some good stuff. The other part is it's not paid for, right? They said it was going to be paid for. And look, this is not, we just went through a pandemic, okay? And in this pandemic, we had to spend money we didn't have because, frankly, there's no country in the world that didn't. And no country in the world had a rainy day fund for a global pandemic. So we had to do that, and we understood it. So I think now, as we spend money moving forward, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we are not today where we were 3 or 4 years ago. We already have an existing mountain of debt created by this pandemic. We have to have economic growth to get out of it. And so the problem with this bill is it's got 350 billion when you add it all up, a net add to the debt over the next 10 years. And so I think it should have been reduced by that amount. And I think it should have really focused on the things that could unite everybody and not add some of these other things in it. And look, it's 2,700 pages, right? So that's the other problem here. Even now, people think that's not a lot. You still got to read it very carefully because there are provisions in there that, you may not know what they mean unless you catch it. And things like, the potential for a device being installed in trucks to track the mileage and things of this nature. These are things that slip through.
Let me hone in on exactly that, Senator. A couple of months ago, Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, said absolutely not. There will be nothing about mileage taxes in there, nothing about counting how many miles you drive. Take a listen to what he said to CNN.
You said also that a mileage tax showed, quote, a lot of promise as a way to help pay for the plan. That tax would charge people for how many miles they drive. Is that under consideration?
No, that's not part of the conversation about this infrastructure bill.
Is there a possible increase in the gas tax? That's a tax that has not been raised in years, as you know. Is that under consideration?
No, and again, I want to reiterate the president's central commitment here. If you're making less than $400,000 a year, this proposal will not involve a tax increase for you.
So Senator, 2,700 pages later, it sounds like a lot of those things that Buttigieg just said will not be in there actually are. In fact, there's $125 million for a pilot program studying how exactly we can tax everyone per mile. And, by the way, let's talk about this. Never once have I seen a Democrat say this tax will replace that tax. It's usually this tax will add to that tax. Your thoughts?
Yeah, look, there was a lot of money left over from the pandemic spending that had not been spent. And so repurposing some of that money would have made sense. But that would have taken us to, a bill that would have been at least $300 billion less than this one. And he's technically right. I mean, there's no gas tax in it. What is in it is the mechanism you would use to one day have a gas tax, right? If you can begin to track miles and set up a pilot program to study how that would look like, then you come back in a couple of years and say, okay, here's, this thing is costing more money than we thought, and here's a way to pay for it. So you're laying the groundwork for one down the road, because ultimately this stuff has to be paid for. And again, look, I get it, okay? During the pandemic, we had to deficit spend. A lot of people point to the tax cuts, although I think there's a big difference between allowing people to keep more of their own money. To me, that's not government spending. That's government not collecting money that doesn't belong to them. But this is different. This is actually borrowing and spending this money above and beyond what we already did over the last 2 years because we had to.
And $3.5 trillion coming maybe as soon as next week. Tell us about that, sir. Is that a given? Is that one going to fly by without any Republican support?
Well, that's the other problem. Yeah, that's the other problem with this bill, is that this bill is part of a two-pronged dance, right? The first step is passing this, and then what Nancy Pelosi has said is, this is great, but we're not passing this transportation bill that 60-something senators want unless we pass a $3-point-something trillion expansion of the federal government into every aspect of our lives. And so what's going to happen here is a lot of people are going to say, well, I'm not for that. I wasn't for that. I only voted for the transportation bill. But they'll know full well, okay, that the reason why we even got to that 3-point-something trillion spending is because of the support they gave the transportation bill. And that's what this does. This now opens the door and creates the glide path for that other thing to happen. And that alone is reason for me to be against it. These things should stand on their own. They shouldn't be linked. She publicly linked it. And that is right there where they lost me.
Yeah, and that is that's from the pressure from the squad. That's AOC and the other leftist, far left wing of the party saying, hey, no, we're not. So folks understand. So the Senate passes this piece of legislation. Then they take up the next piece of legislation. And then it goes to the House. It says whether or not they're going to actually spend the money, because that's where the checkbook is. And the House is saying, oh no, these have to go together or forget it. And so the pressure is on those two senators, Senator Manchin in West Virginia and Senator Sinema in Arizona, to come along, because they said originally they might not be for the 3.5, they're for the 1.2. So they may be forced, they may be arm twisted into signing on board for all of them, just so that the squad is happy, Pelosi's happy, and they get their, what is that, $4.7 trillion of spending, which, by the way, a tiny fraction of it is actually infrastructure spending. Senator, before we go, something important to you and near and dear to my heart as well. I am absolutely all about Cuba, love Cubans, love everything about it. I actually have a young man who I sponsor who's a Cuban American here trying to become a nurse in America. Tell us about this bill that you're sponsoring to bring the internet to Cuba. And again, this would be part of infrastructure, would it not?
Well, it's part of this reconciliation budget that ultimately is, and what we do is, I mean, it's this technical language, but we create this reserve fund that basically requires the federal government to figure out a way of how we can provide free, unfettered internet access to as many people in Cuba as possible. And that's a big deal for a couple of reasons. The reason why these protests and this sort of turning on the government has taken to the next level is because Cubans have somewhat access to the internet in terms of being able to go on social media and not just talk to each other, but also communicate with the world, show the world the reality of Cuba, and get news and information from abroad. So we were actually working on this under the Trump administration. Had President Trump still been there, I think we would have been far ahead on it. Unfortunately, that got set back. And look, it's problematic because a lot of people in the White House that don't want any of that. I mean, there are people, the person in charge of Cuba at the State Department right now, and the person in charge of Cuba at the National Security Council right now, are people that are in favor of the Obama policy of opening up to Cuba, which was a total failure and a disaster. So we're going to have some resistance from them. They give lip service to internet. We haven't seen them do a thing yet. And so this is sort of pushing them and forcing their hand to do it.
You know, Senator, anything we can do here, I'd like to bring it back and talk a little bit more about that. I think the social media companies should be involved in this as well. Let's get some internet access to Cuba, to free Cuba, to let the people choose freedom over dictatorship in Cuba. Senator Rubio, appreciate your time always. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Eric. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Rob Finnerty. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please join the conversation in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, too. Hit the bell icon to be alerted to breaking news. And remember, there's a whole lot more on Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news network. Newsmax TV, where real news for real people.